what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to discuss the various spaces of the head and neck. Now, I want to assure you that the spaces of the head and neck were not defined or developed to torture residents or faculty members when they take their boards or when they're reading out. They really were first defined many, many years ago by the great French anatomist. And so the key thing to the spaces of the head and neck is that the anatomy is really important. And one thing about radiologists is that back in medical school, we really didn't get much training in the anatomy. So if you understand the anatomy, then the spaces are going to make sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the spaces. The first space that we're going to talk about is the masticator space. And the masticator space is comprised of the 4 muscles of mastication. So it's all anatomy. So this is the masseter muscle. This muscle right here is the temporalis muscle. We then have a muscle right here, which is the lateral pterygoid muscle, which we can see right here. And then we have another muscle, which is just below it, which is the medial pterygoid muscle. So if I had to rename the muscle, I would call it superior and inferior pterygoid muscle as opposed to lateral and medial, but I don't have that option. Now, the second component of the masticator space is going to be formed by the mandible. So the mandible, in this case, we can see the condyle right here, and then we can see the coronoid process. And the third component is formed by the nerve, and there's a little oval nerve right here. So if I had to contour the masticator space, I would take my arrow, I would come around like this. I go around the condyle of the mandible. Then when I get to this nerve, I include the nerve and then continue anteriorly. So the point is that the largest component of the masticator space is going to be muscle. The second largest component is going to be bone. And the third component is going to be nerve. So when you look at something like this, you have to ask yourself, this is the head and neck, so it's got to be really, really hard. But the point is that are there any other structures in the body that have the same components as the masticator space? And the answer is obviously yes. So if you look at the thigh basically is the same as the masticator space. It contains muscle, it contains bone, and it contains nerve. So when we start talking about differential diagnosis involving the head and neck structures, just realize that the components of the head and neck, the vast majority of these, are seen everywhere else in the body. So as a result, when you're building your differential diagnosis, don't initially go to the weird head and neck stuff, but think of other things that can occur in the body. So this is an example of a mass involved in the masticator space. How do I know it's in the masticator space? Draw a line down the middle, compare the left side to the right side, and you can see the center of this is located right in the masticator space. And because we know that muscle is the largest component of this, well, we can make the diagnosis of leiomyosarcoma. If I told you the same thing right here, this is a mass that's involving a child. What's the largest component of the masticator space? Well, it's muscle. What's the most common soft tissue malignancy in a child? It's rhabdomyosarcoma. And because the largest component is muscle in a child, we can make the diagnosis of rhabdomyosarcoma. The second most common component of the masticator space is bone. So these are examples of bony lesions. In this case, this is an osteoma involving the condyle of the mandible. Now, this is one of the unusual jaw lesions that we see. I kind of call them crazy jaw lesions. I'm not going to get into a lot of the differential, but in the context of this talk, I just want you to know when you're building your differential diagnosis for the masticator space, you always have to consider bony lesions, just like you do if you were doing the thigh. In this case, it just happens to be one of the unusual ones, but just remember, myeloma, metastases, chondrosarcomas, osteosarcomas, the same things that can occur in the thigh can occur in the masticator space. And in this case, we always have to remember the nerve. So as I mentioned before, when you draw a line down the middle, compare the right side to the left side, we talked about the lateral pterygoid muscle here. And notice the pterygoid muscle is being displaced medially. And there is a mass that's located right here. And when we look at the coronal images, notice how this mass is oblong and sausage-shaped, and it's extending through the skull base, and it's actually widening foramen ovale. So when you take this combination of the proximity and you look at the coronal images, we can see that's extending through the skull base and widening foramen ovale, so we can make the diagnosis of a V3 neurofibroma.